So hello biology students, and welcome to this video where we're going to be introducing chemistry, and more specifically, we're going to be discussing the chemistry of water. So before we get into our discussion of water, first let's talk about why we care about chemistry, which is a good question because we are in biology class, not chemistry class. So the short answer is that all of the sciences are interrelated, and really to understand any science, you need to understand the other scientific classes as well. But more specifically, biology involves studying structures and functions. So that could be the structure and function of an organism, it could be the structure and the function of an organ, or even a molecule. And we already talked about how when we organize biological things and biological structures, we talk about from the molecular level all the way to the biosphere. So because molecules, which we're really interested in, are made up of atoms, and chemistry study is really the study of atoms and molecules and how they interact, it's really important for us to understand some very, very basic chemistry before we jump into biology. So let's discuss the basics and some basic vocabulary words, and then we'll get into talking about water, which will help lead us into our discussion of living things. So element is a word that's seen in chemistry a lot, and an element is basically the word that means something that cannot be chemically broken down into anything simpler. So it's basically the simplest piece of matter that you can have. So there are 118 elements that are known to man. They're on the periodic table of the elements. There are things like carbon, there are things like iron, copper, neon. 92 of those occur in nature, naturally. The other ones were man-made in labs. And of those 92, 25 are essential for living things. So you can kind of imagine in biology, we're much more interested in those 25 essential elements than any other elements on the periodic table. So in particular, of those 25, 6 of the 25 make up 99% of living things. So in other words, if you take any kind of living thing, whether it be a person, whether it be a fungi, whether it be a bacterial cell, and you look at what made it up, 99% of that living thing is made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So 99% of you is made up of those 6 elements. You should know these. These are elements that will come up over and over again in our class. You could use the acronym CHOMPS to help you remember them. I always learned it as SPONCH, S-P-O-N-C-H. Okay, so however you can remember it, either as CHOMPS or SPONCH, those are the 6 elements that make up 99% of living things. Okay, so the last word I want to introduce here is atom. We already know atom from Unit 1 in our levels of organization, but I want you to imagine if you took an element like carbon or hydrogen and you took the smallest piece of that could still be considered carbon, like the smallest bit of a chunk of carbon that's still carbon, that is an atom. So the smallest particle of an element that still retains its properties. We also know from the levels of organization lesson that atoms are made up of subatomic particles, and that it turns out these subatomic particles always have the same general arrangement. So let's talk about those subatomic particles a little bit. So our first subatomic particle is an electron. And electrons are found on the outside portion of an atom, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. Those outside portions are called energy levels. Electrons are negatively charged, and they could be symbolized with a symbol E-. Protons are found in the center of the atom, and the center of the atom is called the nucleus, just like the center of the cell is sometimes called the nucleus. They are positively charged, and they can be written in shorthand with a P+. And then finally, neutrons are also located in the center of the atom, the nucleus. They have no charge, they are neutral, hence their name, and they can be abbreviated with N subscript 0. So here's a picture of an atom. So you can see this is a single atom. You can see all the protons and neutrons are in the nucleus, which is in the center, and then the electrons are located in the outside in what's called the energy circles. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about some basic chemistry vocabulary, let's jump into the part of chemistry that we're really actually interested in biology, and that's the discussion of a really important molecule that we know as water. So water is really important for living things. In fact, without water, life on Earth would not be possible. So therefore, as we look to other planets to see if water exists there, one of the first things that scientists look for is to see if water is present. Water covers more than 3/4 of Earth's surface, and if you were to mass out all of the different components in your body, in fact, between 70 and 95% of your mass, or really any organism's mass, would be water. In humans, this is about 72%. So like many things in biology, the structure of the water molecule allows it to perform its function. Okay, so therefore, in order for us to understand the important function water plays for living things, we first have to understand its structure. So the structure of water is that it's a polar molecule. And what this means is that the electrons that are shared in the bonds of atoms, those electrons are shared unevenly. That's the definition of a polar bond. So we already know from the last video that the bonds found in water are covalent bonds. And therefore, by definition, because water has covalent bonds, that means the atom, so if I draw a water molecule here, this oxygen and these two hydrogens, the electrons that are in these bonds are being shared because it's a covalent bond. However, these electrons are not being shared equally, and therefore these bonds are actually called polar covalent bonds, and that makes water a polar molecule. So as we're going to see on the next slide, because water is a polar molecule and because these electrons are not being shared equally, this is going to create one end of the water molecule that's a little bit negatively charged and one end of the water molecule that's a little bit positively charged. However, one thing I really want to stress is that water itself is neutral. Even though it's going to have a positive and negative end, because the total number of protons, if you add up the protons and the two hydrogens and the one oxygen, is equal to the total number of electrons, it's electrically neutral, okay? So that's an important point to keep in mind. So let's talk about how this polarity works. So we already know from the previous video that in order that we can calculate the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons in an atom. So if you look at a periodic table and look at oxygen, the atomic number is 8 for oxygen, which means that oxygen right here has 8 protons. And if you look at the atomic number for hydrogen, that is 1, which means each hydrogen here has 1 proton. So right here, these two electrons right here, this is the covalent bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen, and there's a second covalent bond right here. So you can imagine these two electrons, they're bouncing back and forth between the oxygen molecule and the hydrogen molecule, and the oxygen molecule and the hydrogen molecule. And they're bouncing back and forth because they're being shared. However, if you're an electron, you're negatively charged, which means if there's an oxygen right here that has 8 protons, 8 positive charges, and a hydrogen right here that has 1 measly positive charge, you're going to be much more attracted to the oxygen because those 8 positive charges are going to have a stronger pull on you. So now I want you to imagine that if you're these electrons, you're bouncing back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. However, because the protons have a stronger pull on you, you're spending more time over there and only occasionally bouncing back towards the hydrogen. So basically, to kind of conclude here, there is a higher probability of you finding the electrons in these covalent bonds near the oxygen atom than you would find them near the hydrogen atoms. So overall, what this is going to result in, because the electrons are hanging out more often near the oxygen atom, this is going to give the oxygen a slightly negative charge. Electrons are negatively charged, and if they're hanging out more often near the oxygen, on the whole, oxygen is going to have a slight negative charge. So we abbreviate this with this funny looking S and then a negative sign. This means that the oxygen end of the molecule is slightly negative. Similarly, the hydrogen atoms are going to have a slight positive charge because the electron that would normally help to neutralize hydrogen is hanging out, neutralize the proton in hydrogen is hanging out closer to the oxygen most of the time, leaving the hydrogens with a slightly positive charge. And this is what we call a polar molecule, a molecule that has two different charges on either side. You have a slight negative end and slight positive ends. Now, because water is a polar molecule, this creates a really important property in water where it has the ability to form what are called hydrogen bonds. And a hydrogen bond is when the positive end of one water molecule is attracted to the negative oxygen atom in another water molecule. So a hydrogen bond is an attraction between two water molecules. Okay, so you have to have two water molecules if you're going to form a hydrogen bond. There are not hydrogen bonds within one water molecule. So you can see that in this picture here. So here I have this water molecule here has my slightly negative. And you can see it is forming these weak bonds called hydrogen bonds with the hydrogen atom of another water molecule because that hydrogen atom is slightly positively charged. Water molecules can form as many as 4 hydrogen bonds at a time. So my one water molecule here is hydrogen bonding with 1, 2, 3, 4 other waters. And these bonds are not as strong as covalent or ionic bonds, so therefore we call them weak bonds even though they are relatively strong. Okay, so that's it for the first video on water, and I'll see you in the next one.